All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So you're in the talk for what's working on mobile games. My name is Rade Stojsavljevic. I'm the guy that runs Oculus Studios' mobile division. We're responsible for publishing second-party titles with developers around the world, just like yourselves. And one of the things that we consistently hear from our developers is, what kinds of things are working in mobile? What kinds of tips, tricks, techniques can you give us? Can you share some data about what types of content users prefer? How are they using the device? So we're going to talk about that today. And with me are going to be two gentlemen from our studios that have released titles that I think are going to be pretty interesting for you guys to talk about. So today we're going to go through details of our learning. We're going to bring up gentleman Eddie from Coatsink Software, developers of the Esper series, more recently A Night Sky and Augmented Empire. And then Brock Heinz from Turtle Rock Studios, who did Face Your Fears. They also launched The Well today on Gear VR, and they're doing the partnership with Stranger Things for Face Your Fears that's coming out later this month. And then we're going to wrap it up. I'll talk a little bit about what's coming next with some of the new hardware that we just announced this morning. So this ungainly chart is kind of how we look at search on Gear VR. So these are all the raw search results kind of grouped by categories of what people are looking at. And one of the things that you're going to notice on this as I go through it in some more detail is you're not going to see games as a huge section. And the reason for that is when people are looking for games, they're looking for individual titles. And so when you add them all up, it's a pretty significant area. But individually, they just don't show up on a chart like this. So first off, free. We see a lot of people looking for free content. And we ask ourselves, why is that? Besides just not wanting to pay for content, a lot of people are getting their headset as part of a deal when they get their phone. When they get their Samsung S7 or S8 phones, they can get the headset for free sometimes when they're running a promotion. They're getting it as a gift or other reasons like that. And they don't really know what they like in VR. So they're looking for demo content, free stuff to try it out and kind of get a sense of what's what. So if I told you, for example, of a particular genre like a roller coaster was awesome, you'd be like, yeah, I've seen that in 2D. That's not particularly fun. But I'll get to that in a minute. It actually turns out it's really good in VR. The other thing is, because they don't know what they like, free to try is an experiment that we've started running. And we've seen some initial data on this that indicates that it's a good idea. We'll know more in the next couple months, but it's something to think about if you've got a really killer experience and it's kind of new and different and it's hard to describe. Consider free to try. Let the players check it out, and then you could always monetize for the rest of it. And if it's something people like, they're going to buy it. One thing to note, before I joined Oculus, I spent a couple years doing free to play. We're not at the kinds of high tens of millions to hundreds of millions of users to make that top of funnel free to play experience work. We'll get there eventually, but if you try that now, just keep in mind you really got to know what you're doing because it's tricky. The second biggest area we see is roller coasters, and this was kind of surprising when we've seen this. It's consistently been a top result for the past year on Gear VR. And what our thinking on this, because we see this on whether it's a pre-recorded video roller coaster or a real-time roller coaster, is it can evoke a visceral feeling in people. They actually like that kind of uncomfortable pit in their stomach feel that you can get from motion in something like this, but it's never really enough to make people sick. So yeah, it's just something people love, and they seem to have an insatiable appetite for it. Interestingly enough, there's two squares up here. One of them is roller coaster and variants like that. The other is montaña rusa, which literally is Spanish for Russian mountain, which is the word for roller coaster. Which oddly enough, if you go on Wikipedia and go down that click hole like I did when I was researching this, it actually means, montaña rusa in Russian means American mountain, which is kind of bizarre. They use a different term for it, so it's like this weird circular logic. And then horror is one of the top results that we always get. This is going to spike significantly later this month as Halloween comes along. The story on this, Face Your Fears was born from this search chart. One of our analytics guys was looking at this. It's like, man, people really, really like to be scared. So we were noodling around with what to do on that. We talked to Turtle Rock Studios about it. They've got a pretty extensive experience building AAA content. We thought, all right, what happens if we do AAA with the top search result? And we married those two together. And for the past year, it's been one of our top performing apps on the platform. Jump scares, as much as people like to kind of complain about those, they love them. Customers love jump scares. They work exceedingly well in VR. And it's not just fun for the person that's inside of VR, but like if you scare your family members with it, is awesome. Like my wife hates spiders, and like when she sees the spider fear and face your fears, she says, if you ever put that on me, I'm going to divorce you. So you can have some fun with your folks on that, especially around Halloween, Christmas, Thanksgiving, stuff like that. So in terms of metrics that we look at, the three things that Oculus takes a look at are retention metrics, or time spent and adoption. And we measure these a little bit differently than the way you may be used to on other platforms. Our retention is measured over a 28-day period. And the reason we look at that is we see cyclical use of content. People, when they put their headsets on, it spikes up on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays. It drops a little bit on Mondays, kind of hovers on the weekend, then it picks up again. So if you were to just measure any individual day or even a 3-day period, you kind of get a weird number depending on what day of the week. By spacing it out 28 days, you get rid of some of that fluctuation and get a more accurate result. Time spent is how much time in minutes somebody spends in a headset when they just put it on in a session. And then adoption, we take a look at how many users have downloaded an app and installed it versus the available users in that particular month. So as the audience is growing, you can make an accurate comparison like between something now and something 6 months ago, or even longer. So when you look at these categories, you see content aggregators show up in retention. These are things where they're bringing in a lot of different content and updates constantly. And it kind of gave us the idea to start looking at in-app purchases and downloadable content as a way to extend the retention curve for titles. That works really, really well. Major updates that you advertise do really, really well, giving people a reason to come back to your content. Multiplayer games, those tend to work. Asynchronous, I would recommend over synchronous, just because we have issues sometimes getting people all on the platform at the same time. VR is kind of what we call it appointment driven. You set aside your time when you want to play, and that's when you're going to play. And if your friends are online, hey, that's awesome. If they're not, maybe you just catch them next session. It's not something that you just drop everything that you're doing and put it on. You may have kids running around the house or something, and you can't just put the headset on and not pay attention to them. And then demo content. This is the kind of thing that you're going to want to show your friends, your family, what's possible in VR. We see huge numbers for that type of content spike up around Christmas. It's not that that same user is retaining over a long period. It's just they're using that app as kind of their go-to showcase of VR. In terms of time spent, deep and repeatable gameplay. One of Eddie's company's games, Augmented Empire, has got 10 hours of gameplay. People spend a lot of time playing that. It's one of our top 2 in terms of engagement. And then multiplayer again, like you would see with Anshar Wars 2 and Dragonfront. In terms of adoption, it's a little more complicated. Coasters, it's a top search term. Whoops, went one too fast. Oh well, I'll just talk to it. Coasters, horror are some of the top things that you'll see with that. And then the last one, let me just move through this really quick, is IP. If you've got a quality title with an IP that overlaps nicely with it, it's a multiplicative effect for your adoption. If it's a great IP and your game sucks, it's not going to help you that much. And if the IP doesn't fit with what the product is, it might actually hurt you. So the interesting thing is looking at this list is IP doesn't automatically jump to the top of the list like sometimes you might think. It needs to be married with a quality title. In terms of how the audience is using the device, there's 2 fundamental input systems that you've got on Gear. There's the touchpad that comes with every Gear VR, and then when we launched or Samsung launched the Gear VR with the orientation remote or the controller earlier this year, you've now got that input scheme. So what we found with this is it's split. Roughly 2/3 of people across all content like to just use the touchpad. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're not using it for games. It could be they're watching a video, and then you don't want to hold this in your hand the whole time, so you just put it away, or you just know you're going to do a video, and you just sit back and you watch it. Excuse me. But for users that use the games, as Hugo was saying this morning, they're spending 50 minutes on average. They spend significantly less time just using the touchpad. So when you're deciding on what type of content you want to build, and how it's structured, you got to figure out, do I just do one? Do I do the other, or do I do both? And one of the things we're recommending is you support both. It's pretty trivial if you're going to do the touchpad to add the remote. And then you could also add a mode where you're pointing around with content on the controller as well. You're just going to see higher engagement numbers. Interestingly enough, if you look at controllers that use the gamepad, these are the Bluetooth controllers that used to exist, and people bought a lot of them before the Samsung controller came out. They had extremely high engagement on their products. They were high retentive. I mean, you knew if you were going to go out and spend $30 to $50 on a controller, you're more likely to buy games. You can now access deeper games. You're going to spend a lot of time with it. It's just a smaller portion of the audience, and that's why we recommend using the orientation remote. It can just support a lot more users. In terms of broader platform metrics, there's kind of 3 key learnings we've got here. First off is, given the choice between different perspectives, first person, third person, like a top-down, tabletop, diorama, customers overwhelmingly prefer first-person content. We launched an amazing game with Coatsink called Augmented Empire, and it was kind of set up like this diorama, and it's absolutely gorgeous. You're going to see some clips from it in a little bit. But the consistent bit of feedback we got from customers and from press was it just didn't feel immersive enough. So VR is a very immersive platform. You want to put the player in the middle of all of that. Customers want you to take advantage of VR. If you have to ask yourself this question when you're doing every title, why does this product exist in VR versus just on 2D? And if it could work on either one of them, customers are smart. They're going to call you out on that, and they might not actually want to download your product. Lastly is friction. Drop in VR right now, you have to take your phone out of your case if you've got that. You've got to dock it in the headset, and you've got to put it on. So there's a bit of friction with that. Don't put your best stuff too far into the experience. Put it up front. Customers want to be wowed immediately. If you've got something that they've gone through that and they put it on, and you've got something amazing that hooks them within the first 15 seconds, that's awesome. It's even more critical if your app is a free app, because customers have a very short attention span. I think everybody would realize that from mobile app development. It's especially true here. Put your best stuff up front. So next up, I'm going to bring Eddie from Coatsink Software up. He's going to talk about a couple of his titles. Eddie?
Thanks, Rade. Good afternoon, everybody. Like Rade said, my name is Eddie Beardsmore. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Coatsink. Coatsink is a game developer based in the northeast of the UK, in the happy little town known as Sunderland. And if you don't know where that is, I've put it on a map for you. For a bit more perspective, like a lot of people like to compare the UK, or the shape of the UK, to that of Westeros from Game of Thrones. And if that's true, then we are Winterfell. So it's very cold, it's very grey, but we're the good guys. But that, of course, means that London is King's Landing, and it's full of rich people that nobody likes. And Scotland is full of wildlings. So it's a fairly fair comparison, if you ask me. But anyway, this is us. We are 53 strong now. And this is very much due to our growing the relation that we've had with Oculus for the past few years. We have 4 games available on the Samsung Gear VR store right now. And today I'm going to talk you through each of these titles, what I think we did right and wrong, and our general best practices. But first, here is a short montage video of our work. So the first title I'm going to talk to you about is the original Esper. This launched back in March 2015 with the Innovator edition of the Samsung Gear VR. The basic principle of the game is you have telekinetic powers, and it's a first-person puzzle game. And the government is testing you to make sure you are not a threat to the rest of the general public. And the first thing that I think we did right with this title was when Oculus sent us the headsets, and we were obviously testing it out and seeing what we thought worked, and you control the game using a touchpad on the side, obviously all of our players looked like this. And seeing people play the game like this, we thought instantly, what does this make you think of? And for us, it was superheroes. It was, X-Men or telekinetic powers. And this became the core mechanic of the game. And so my first bit of advice, which comes from this, is just design for the platform. And people responded really well to that. It was just last night, somebody mentioned to me that with Esper, that control scheme was perfect. One thing that was a slight oversight with Esper was it was about a 45 to an hour experience, and everything took place in one room. You had all the puzzles that you can see behind me, like animating in and out. And this introduced quite a few technical issues, not to mention just the complex animations, but also like the baking the light in, and just having everything in one scene in Unity was a bit of trouble. But one thing that we definitely got right, which I think makes Esper stand out, especially in those early days, was the introduction of Jeff. Jeff was a fully voiced narrator of the story. He led the players through all the trials, provided instruction, but he also had the typical British sarcasm and brought a lot of humor to the game. And he would respond differently to how the player was playing. So if they were ignoring the trials altogether, he would tell them off, and so on and so forth. So I think this level of humor and comfort and having somebody there with you in a game and almost like your companion for the whole experience really helps players feel settled and comfortable in the game. You have to remember this could be, especially back in the Esper days, that this was probably somebody's first time in VR, and putting this headset on is quite an alien experience, and it still reigns true today. So having that bit of humor and somebody there with you, for us, works really well. And Esper was received very well in the VR community back there, and it led to its successor, which was Esper 2. And in Esper 2, we ramped up everything, all the good stuff from Esper 1. So that core mechanic remained the same. You were controlling some objects with telekinetic powers using a touchpad on the side of the headset. But we introduced a much deeper story. So now in Esper 2, you work for the government and you are chasing down a rogue telekinetic. We introduced new characters, fully voiced again. We brought in a few well-known actors like Nick Frost, that some people quite know. He plays Ernie in Esper 2. And Sean Pertwee plays the villain of the piece. And having all these characters, and again, talking to the player throughout, just again, made them feel like it was this world out there. They weren't alone in it. And again, we ramped up the humor because we found that worked really well with Esper. People were no longer trapped in one room. We have all these interesting environments, which you can see behind me. And these actual environments impacted on the puzzles. So for example, the final chapter takes place in space. So zero gravity means to a much different puzzles when it comes to telekinetic. So we introduced a few new mechanics like gaze detection, which I'm not going to talk too deeply about because Brock will talk about later. And finally, to touch on locomotion, we opted for teleportation. So once the player had finished their puzzle, they had the choice to move forward. And that worked really well for us. It kept that sense of presence and immersion that we were all looking for. The one thing that I think we got slightly wrong with Esper, or Esper 2, sorry, was like Rade just touched on. We left all the good stuff, all the really interesting environments and all the best mechanics a bit till later stages of the game. And the first chapter is more just learning the mechanics. And it's still fun, but all the stuff later on is much better, in my opinion. So if I was going to redesign the game again, I'd bring all that stuff a bit forward, because especially when we were demoing the title, it held us back a bit. But that's Esper 2. So the next title is A Night Sky. You may have seen this in the keynote earlier. A Night Sky was launched with the Samsung Gear VR remote back in April of this year. And the premise for this for us was we wanted just to show off what is fantastic about mobile VR, that like what you can only experience in VR. We wanted this to be like one of the applications that people come to when they're first and foremost, when they're like showing VR to like their friends or family. And it's a very simple premise. You're sat in this beautiful environment you can see behind me. It's like a Wild West environment. And there's this clear night sky above you. And you have the remote, and there's some stars in the sky, and you start drawing constellations. And when you finish a constellation, whichever character or creature you draw comes to life in the environment. And you can see a few of them behind me. And again, each of these creatures and characters were designed to show off that something that's really cool in VR. So for example, here's in one of these pictures, there's a golem that forms, like a rock golem that forms from some of the rocks and stones in the environment, and he's about 100 to 150 feet tall. He starts off in the background, and he comes right up to the player. And it just really demonstrates the really scale, the sense of scale that you can get in VR that you can't experience on a 2D monitor. And he comes in and almost crushes you with his finger, which is huge. And he almost invades your personal space, which again, you can't recreate outside of VR. And it's just very unique and very special. And there's also another character that we have is a swarm of butterflies that come in and just dancing around the player, accompanied by beautiful music and sound effects. And it just shows off the 3D space that you can take advantage of. And all the characters have done very well. I have to apologize to the one guy in the reviews because he was afraid of butterflies. So it was more of a nightmare situation for him. So like I was saying, Night Sky launched as a free application with the remote back in April. And since June, we've been releasing DLC at the end of every month. And we've just seen the benefits, we've just reaped the benefits of this. The DLC packs are priced at $1, and they include some extra animations with some new characters and some mini games. We've introduced a little bit more interaction to the game. And doing it this way, with that free application first as a parent app, worked really well. We've got thousands and thousands of people getting into the game and getting it onto their store and really enjoying it. The reviews were really good, and they were just asking for more stuff. And that's what we delivered. And they were really happy with the DLC. Each DLC pack is priced at $1, so it's very reasonable. And with the extra visibility that you get on the store because you're bringing new content, as well as things like push notifications, you can just see the amount of users that you get just ramping up. And again, I want to touch on one thing that I mentioned earlier about in the Esper titles. It's the companion characters that it's kind of, we seem to have in all of our Coatsink titles. Even in the night sky, the first constellation that you draw is this owl. I think he is on one of these pictures. I've seen him go by. And he swoops in, and he comes in and sits in the environment with you. And it's just us trying to recreate that sense of you're not alone in this environment. And this is something that's repeated through all of our titles, now and moving forward. So the final title I'm going to talk to you about is our most ambitious project, and it's come up already today, is Augmented Empire. This is a 10-hour turn-based tactical RPG, as my marketing department likes to put it. And the basic premise is you are sat in an armchair in your secluded hideout, and you lead a team of about 6 misfits via this AR hologram that appears on the table in front of you. You can see some of the images behind me. And this is from the in-mission screenshots. So this is the hologram that appears on the table. And all the lights in the hideout kind of darken down. You can see the kind of wireframe which replaces it. And in these missions, you take place in turn-based combat, leading your team around. And then once you're out of combat, it's like free exploration around these beautiful environments that our artists have created. And this is where you can do all the good RPG stuff, like talk to NPCs, collect items, and things like that. And then once you finish a mission, the hologram shuts down, a very nice effect on that, and you return back to your hideout, all the lights come back up. And this is where you plan for the next missions. You talk to your partner in crime, which is Hartman, which is your companion for this game, and you can do the mission upgrades and all that good stuff. And one thing that was our aim for Augmented Empire was the narrative. There was one thing that we noticed on the Gear VR store, that there wasn't any titles that really had this strong narrative, and that's something that we always want to bring to our games. We had some in Esper and Esper 2, but nothing like the scale that we went with Augmented Empire. We hired a narrative designer who started from day one, and he started building the lore and the world behind Augmented Empire. And it's a 30,000-word script, which is fully VO'd. We have over 50 characters in the game with multiple endings, and then you make certain decisions which reflect on everything that happens in the game. So that was the challenge from the beginning. It was just that scale of a project. But I'm very proud of the way that the story came out. It's always been reflected in the reviews. Almost the first thing that people mention is, this seems like bigger than most of the stuff that's out there on the Gear VR, and we're very proud of that. It was very interesting. Somebody said to me that you can always tell when a story is really good or interesting because it feels like when you jump into that game or the film or whatever, that world has been there for a long time. You're just part of it. It hasn't just started because you've started the game. That world has always been there. And I feel like that we achieved that with Augmented Empire. I've touched on already that we had so many characters fully VO'd. It was over 50. I think I'm in there somewhere. I'm one of the NPCs. And the city itself, I hope you agree, looks absolutely amazing. And the reason it does is not only that we have a fantastic art team, but again, like we did with Esper, we designed for the headset. We knew it was going to be a Samsung Gear VR product, so we knew there was no positional head tracking. And this means you can optimize the art to a certain degree, so it's because you know where the player's head is. So that means you can bake in a lot of good stuff, so bake in reflections in puddles and whatnot. One or two issues that we had with the hologram, or the hologram effect in front of the player, was to make sure that the player wasn't looking down all the time, and to reduce neck strain, we tilted the environment so it would pop up on the hologram and like move forward like this. And this did cause a bit of discomfort for one or two players, but generally it was fine. And a new challenge was just because of the scale of the project was just the balancing, like the multiple endings, and all. Like if a player wanted to, they could upgrade one character completely and ignore the rest. So it's just making sure that we have the right balancing, which was something that we didn't have to do with any of our previous titles. And to mitigate this, we had a QA team from the very beginning. But the Augmented Empire launched in July 2017, and we couldn't have been happy with the reception. I haven't seen it then less out of 8 out of 10 from any of the websites and press. So this is my final slide. I'm just going to quickly summarize what I've said today, and this is some of Coatsink's best practices. But this is not to say that this is what you should do, it's just what we do when we're approaching a new title. So first and foremost, I've said it already, is designed for the headset. The Gear VR is a fantastic product, and so will be the Oculus Go. We're going to have all of our titles come over to that. And these are great headsets, and they have their constraints, and you should use them for your advantage, like we did with the optimized art and knowing where the player's head is, as well as using the touchpad for Esper. When we design a game, we assume that a player is sat down and they don't have like a swivel chair. You have to assume that this is what we assume is like the general position. So with that in mind, we try and put all the good stuff in the front 120 degrees. And the reason for that is it's quite difficult to turn around sometimes, and it gets a bit repetitive. So anything that's vital to the game or to the story, it goes to the front 120. We do put good fun stuff behind you, but it's never vital to the gameplay or the progression of the player. We're always going to have those companion characters in with our games. It's just something that we're really supportive about, that we just think that it helps players feel relaxed and comfortable. And also the characters and narrative is something that we'll always want to introduce with our games. And finally, 2 years ago at Oculus Connect 2, Jesse Schell from Schell Games did a retrospective of one of his games, and he was talking about how great comedy is in the title. Just for helping players feel comfortable, I've touched on this already, but also that players are much more forgiving of a game that doesn't take itself too seriously. But that's everything from me, and I'm going to hand over to Brock Heinz from Turtle Rock.
Thanks, good job. Thanks, Eddie. Hello, everybody. I'm Brock Heinz. I'm a lead programmer at Turtle Rock Studios. So Turtle Rock has been making games for about 15 years. We started out primarily in the PC and the console markets, making multiplayer action games. Started out with Counter-Strike Condition Zero and some other titles in that space. Moved on to develop Left 4 Dead and Evolve. So the shift to working in mobile VR has been a big change for us in terms of how we think about game design. But it's been a lot of fun, and we'll share some of those thoughts with you today. So we've been working on mobile VR for a little over a year. we use Unreal Engine 4 and WYs. And our first two titles were Face Your Fears and Other Worlds. And to date, Face Your Fears has been our most successful title. And I think this is largely due to our strong emphasis on making it accessible to new players, people who are new to VR, or maybe even people who are new to games. You don't have to know a lot about traditional game mechanics to interact with it. It's very, very easy to just pick up and play. Most of my examples today are going to come from Face Your Fears and Blade Runner, which are both free apps. So if you want to see additional reference, you can check those out. Also, we're releasing The Well today, which is a classic turn-based kind of dungeon crawler. And we also have that in the demo area here. So first, let's start with a few design considerations for mobile VR. The first thing you want to do, and the thing you want to keep in mind as you're developing your title, is you want to meet players' expectations for what a VR title should be. So if you've been making games for a long time, or a lifelong game developer, you might have a gamer's intuition for how certain mechanics should operate. But when people are in VR, they're going to want it to, they're going to want interactions with your environment to work a little bit more like they do in the real world. You want to sort of keep that in mind and be respectful of that. So when you work on the pacing for your title, it's also important to slow that down quite a bit. And as much as you can, allow players to enjoy your game at their pace. A lot of people, especially if they're new to VR, are going to want to look around in your environment, take it all in, and they might not want to be, have their attention like laser focused on a certain, bit of content. Video games are often like a fast-paced kind of sensory overload experience, and that can be overwhelming in VR. So this clip shows an example of pacing from Blade Runner. We wanted to replicate one of the hologram advertisements that you can fly through, that you see in the movies. And so when we set this up, we put the tennis ball in the middle of the scene, and we bounce it a few times to catch the player's attention, and then we knock it at your car. And when we do this, we make sure there's not much else going on, and so we can be sure the player sees it. And this design was much more successful for us than another approach where the racket would just come around the corner and just knock it straight at you, which at first might feel like it has more impact because it's a sudden surprise. But a lot of players would be confused by it, or they might be looking another direction and not see it at all. So it's important to remember in VR that players control where they look, but as designers, we control when and where things happen. So if there's something important going on that you want players to see, you can draw their attention to it using motion cues, lighting, sound effects. But ultimately, they're going to look where they want to look. That's also something that you can use to your advantage. The ability to track what the player is looking at and then respond accordingly is actually a really powerful input. And it's something that you can use subtly, but to a very strong effect on the player. Something we do quite often is if there's something we want the player to see, we'll set it up in the scene, maybe play some associated sounds, and then when they're focused on it, set it off to do whatever it is that's important. Likewise, if you know where the player is looking, you also know where they're not looking. And that's something that you can use to make subtle changes to the scene, maybe to surprise the player with a joke or a scare or whatever makes sense for your title. So when we would develop traditional first-person shooters, we would play some tricks with the size and scale of objects to optimize for player movement through a map, improve gun combat, all that kind of stuff. However, in VR, if objects aren't sized correctly, it can just be a bit confusing and disconcerting to players. So you want to get that as close as possible as you can. However, if an object is real close to the camera, you might need to fudge those rules a little bit. You normally don't want to get anything too close to the camera, maybe 2 feet or 18 inches. But things that are real close, sometimes you need to resize them or make other adjustments so that the players are more comfortable. And this is something where iterating in the headset is extremely important. So this is the inside of a spinner, one of the flying cars from Blade Runner. And we originally built this to the same kind of size and dimensions and layout as one of the movie props. And we quickly found that in VR, it didn't feel comfortable. So we made multiple passes on it. We removed a crossbar that went across the windshield, repositioned elements, maybe changed where they faced so they were easy to see or gave you better sight lines out of the vehicle into the environment. So next, let's talk about some important concepts when developing your art assets for mobile VR. So, as Eddie pointed out, you want to put your important content in front of the player. The rule we use is a roughly 120-degree arc. Like really prolonged or excessive head turning can be uncomfortable, and most players just aren't in free swiveling chairs. Another important thing to decide is if your experience is going to be designed for sitting or standing, and then set your camera height appropriately, and also prompt the player. If somebody is sitting down and they start an experience designed for standing, it's confusing and disconcerting, and they might not even be able to pinpoint why. They just won't enjoy it as much. So what we do in Face Your Fears, for example, is we let the player know, hey, the experience you're about to start is designed for standing or designed for sitting. We let them get comfortable and then start the experience. So we know that the mobile devices we're using can't render like a full game scene at 60 frames per second using like a traditional physically based shading pipeline. And so what you want to do is find a kind of a performance and quality trade-off that works for your style of game and your particular art style. You don't want to pay performance costs that don't provide a lot of value to the player. What we did for Blade Runner and Face Your Fears is used a combination of pre-baked static lighting and then kind of cheap fake dynamic lighting that allowed certain key elements to be reactive, but wouldn't be as costly as a traditionally lit scene. The downside to this is that it does require additional sort of development time, but the performance costs are definitely worth it. So it's important to find a process that generates really high fidelity light maps for your engine, and it's something we've iterated on sort of continuously in development. These are some examples from Face Your Fears. We use Arnold and Maya and then import those into Unreal. You can blend them with your diffuse offline in a package like Photoshop, or you can blend them at runtime in the shader if you want to be able to change the strength of the light map based on changes in the game, like turning on and off a light switch. The second approach is a little bit slower, but it allows the game to be more dynamic. So this is an example of kind of our cheap dynamic lighting from Blade Runner. On the spinner that you're flying around in, there's an unlit material that takes some basic parameters for a kind of a simple lighting value. And then we alter those in scripting as you fly through the map. So it looks like you're kind of flying past all these neon lights. And it sort of reinforces, the effect we're trying to give with the scene, but we're not paying the full cost for, having, tons of lights down that neon lit alleyway. So we know that we want our VR experiences to be really dynamic and alive and provide a lot of fun to players, but we also know that the mobile phones, struggle to do a very complicated simulation at 60 frames per second. So, what we do is, depending on the title, we'll find techniques that allow us to move computation from the phone to our workstations when we're developing the content. Over the years, the game industry is coming up with a lot of techniques for this. There are a lot of talks and papers on this sort of thing. And something you find with all of them is that they have the same basic drawbacks. The first is that they increase your iteration time. It takes more time to see changes in the game, and assets that use these. For example, if you're using light maps, rearranging your map means you've got to do another lighting pass, and then your 15-minute change now takes 2 or 3 hours to preview and that's something you want to keep in mind for scheduling. The second thing, the second drawback to these types of techniques is that they can start to look repetitive, or they can seem to be, because they were baked offline, they might not be reactive to changes going on in the game. What we found is that with most of these techniques, we can parameterize one element of the simulation, adjust that parameter at runtime, and then it feels like it's reacting to the world. For example, in one of our titles, we wanted to have some curtains blowing around, but we knew we couldn't do cloth, and we didn't even want to do skeletal animation if we could get away with it. So we decided to animate a static curtain mesh using vertex animation in the shader. And then we just had a simple parameter for speed, and we just had the scripter adjust that speed parameter when the wind picked up, and it was very convincing, and it also was computationally very cheap. Finally, let's cover some important audio concepts for mobile VR. First, I can't stress strongly enough how important audio is to establish a feeling of presence. When we talk about presence, we talk about fooling the player into feeling they're in this other space, this virtual space that we've created. And audio is a really powerful tool for this, and it's often underused. Used properly, you can establish the size and the layout of your scene, and you can also reinforce things that are going on in your environment that you might not have the CPU time or the GPU time to actually render on the screen. Audio is also going to be your best bang for the buck in terms of development time and runtime performance overhead. It takes less time to develop really high quality audio assets than it does to build lots of models and textures and so on. And likewise, you can play back really high fidelity, really high quality audio, even on a mobile device or on the Oculus Go. You can have a much closer approximation to reality than we currently can with rendered objects. And on more than one project, I've seen this happen where we'll have a build, we'll just do a pass on the audio, and we get playtest feedback about how the graphics look better, which maybe isn't fair to the audio team, but it just really reinforces how strongly that impacts the play experience. So every space in the real world has a 3D audio signature. For a room like this, it could be a hum from your lights or a rumble from the air conditioning system. And if you were to close your eyes and turn your head around, you'd actually be able to hear that the space has a different signature sort of throughout the room. If you recreate this sort of feeling in VR, you can really help lock in the player to your experience. To do this, ideally you would use a pre-recorded ambisonic file, but sometimes that's not going to be available to you. If it's not, one thing you can do is something our team uses, which is a 4-position or a quad air loop to help establish the layout of your space. So this is a diagram that shows kind of an overview of how we do this. There's the 4 air loops kind of in the corner of the diagram here, and each of those is playing just kind of a simple ambient audio sound. And the players can't get closer to them, and they're not attenuated for distance. They're just supposed to help establish the sound of the space itself. And we also turn down the levels on 2 of those loops, so when you turn your head, you really feel that the room is different across the space. Now, on all of these, we set a spread value, which is a parameter that we have in WUIs. It might be different in your audio package, but that helps make that sound take up more space in the environment. And that's something that we've found helps things feel a little bit more correct in VR. If a sound is too localized, it just sounds artificial and fake. And that's one of the first things that'll pull somebody out of an experience. Maybe the most localized sound we'd have is something, for example, a bullet impact, and that still has a bit of a spread value attached to it. So we know from user testing that players who wear headphones enjoy our titles a lot more than players who don't. But we also know from telemetry that only 20 to 30% of mobile VR players do wear headphones. So what do we do about this? Well, the first thing we do is, if you boot up the game and we detect that you're not wearing headphones, we just put up a UI prompt and say, hey, this experience is more enjoyable with headphones. The second thing we do is we do our final mix on headphones just to make sure that it's the best experience that it can be, as we find that has a bit of a better result than mixing on monitors. And then the last thing that we do is we'll detect whether or not headphones are plugged in, and based on that, we'll maybe adjust our mix a little bit. If the player is not wearing headphones, we'll pull out some of the unimportant sounds. So the most important things, your VO, your user interface sounds, so that those things can punch through on the small speaker on the phone. All right, and I'll pass it off to Rade.
Thank you. Thanks, Brock. So I want to talk a little bit about what's coming next. And you guys got a bit of that information this morning at the keynote. Specifically, what's going on with Oculus Go, how we take a look at that, and then what we're thinking about for Santa Cruz. Oculus Go, fundamentally, we see it as Gear VR, the types of content you can build. It's very, very similar to that in terms of compute. The lenses are phenomenal, so whatever you build for Gear is just going to look awesome on Go. And the input is fundamentally the same. It's the same button configuration, so your content is going to work on both. The key thing to keep in mind is there's no touchpad on the side of it. So every piece of content for it is either going to need to be built for the orientation remote, or you're going to need to simulate the touchpad on the side of it, which we do at the SDK level, by just using the touch surface. You're much better designing for the orientation or the controller. It's just a better customer experience, so we strongly recommend you do that. Brock talked a lot about audio, and he's absolutely right. It's critical. As a former sound designer myself, when I started my career 25 years ago in the games industry, I've seen that firsthand. And I don't know what the guys on their hardware engineering team did, if they sacrificed something to some minor demon or whatever, but the audio on it is phenomenal. Like honestly, you put this thing on, it sounds like you're wearing a pair of headphones, and like 2 feet away, the person next to you can't hear what's going on the headset unless you crank it all the way up to 11. So it's just going to create phenomenal presence for you. Santa Cruz is something different entirely. It's effectively a mobile level of compute, but we don't look at it that way in terms of studios. Oculus looks at it as, this is because of the input scheme, like a Rift title. You've got hand presence in there. What does hand presence give you? It gives you the ability to interact physically with objects in there. You could wrap your hand around something like they do on Lone Echo. You're picking things up, manipulating it. You're 6 degrees of freedom. So instead of looking at, for example, an object from one direction that may be one thing, you could walk over here across to the other side and look at it and see how it changes. Exploring a physical space, since it's untethered, is something completely brand new. And the types of experiences you can build for that are really only limited by your imagination. So I would encourage you not to think of that as a mobile device. Really start, if you don't have a kit yet, since they're not shipping until next year, prototype some stuff on Rift. See what you can do on that. Get yourself a cord minder or something so you could simulate that experience. And I think you can get a leg up by the time you start developing content for that platform. Pretty excited about both of those things. As soon as you guys get a chance to check those out, you should absolutely do that. We don't have a lot of time left, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to do a Q&A today. So what we're going to do is Brock, Eddie, and I are going to be outside, and we're happy to answer any questions you guys have. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the show.